Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching How to Eat Like a Medieval Peasant by Tasting History. We recently did our first Tasting History reaction, and I very much enjoyed the video, and so I thought, why don't we do some more? Now, how would you eat like a medieval peasant? Well, it depends at which time throughout the Middle Ages you're talking about, and which region in particular. There is a lot of variability. I think in the sort of popular common imagination, peasants were just eating gruel all the time. It wasn't quite that bad, though oftentimes the peasant diet was quite simple, perhaps a little bland, compared to what many of us would be eating today. But even within the peasant diet, there was a bit of variety, particularly in special times throughout the year. So I'm curious to see what we'll be talking about during this video. If you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
When you think of eating like a medieval peasant, you probably imagine a monotonous diet of cheap bread, stale ale, and peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot 9 days old. And you'd mostly be correct. But there were times, like at the harvest boon work, when even the lowest serf was fed beef, cheese, fine quality bread, and fish, like this dish of fish and garlic sauce from a 15th century cookbook.
Okay, interesting. So, I sort of point this out in the introduction, but typically the peasant diet would be pretty simple, hearty food, but occasionally, at particular times throughout the year, particular celebrations or festivals, even peasants could expect a little bit of variety in their diet. I gotta say, when I think of what did a medieval peasant eat, I think about bread. I mean, bread was the staple of the European diet at this time, in a way that later, following the discovery of the Americas, potatoes would become the staple of the European diet. And other places around the world, rice would be that same staple out in Asia and other places in the Americas. A lot of the indigenous people, maize or corn was that staple food of the diet. And so for medieval peasants, it was bread. But today, it looks like we're going to be talking about a special food that peasants may have gotten to enjoy occasionally.
So thank you to Bombas for sponsoring this video as we learn how to feed a medieval peasant. This time on Tasting History.
And there are, of course, different types of bread, right? That depending on your class, you'd have access to different types, right? The sort of white bread we have today, which for us is our most sort of common type of bread. Back in the Middle Ages, that was actually quite a fancy type of bread that you'd need to be pretty wealthy to enjoy. And in fact, for a lot of the medieval peasants, maybe I shouldn't say a lot, but sometimes if you were in really bad times, if there was a harvest shortage or famine going around, the baker might even slip some sawdust into the bread that the average people would get, just to extend the supply a little bit. So sometimes that bread that you were getting was really not of good quality, but it could depend on the harvest as well.
Now, depending on when and where you are during the medieval period, a peasant could have varying degrees of both wealth and freedom. But regardless...
That is true, right? So when we say peasant, are we talking about the most oppressed serf you could imagine, who really has no surplus for themselves? Or are you talking about, say, a peasant who owns their own land, perhaps has a relatively prosperous farm going, can maybe even hire a couple, one or two laborers to help them work that farm, right? You can find different types of peasants depending on the time and place you look at.
80 to 95% of the people were still classified as someone that we would call peasants who owed a certain amount of work to their lord. Typically, in addition to farming your own strip of land, which you rented from the lord, you would have to spend several days a week farming their strips of land. But then a few times of work, there was something called a boon day, which was basically an extra day of work. It's kind of like when your manager tells you that everyone is coming in on Saturday to do inventory, but he's going to bring in pizza to make it a little bit nicer. And there was a medieval version of the pizza party. All who have come to the wheat harvest boon work shall have for dinner soup, wheaten bread, beef, and cheese, and for supper, bread, cheese, and their fill of ale. And the other day they shall have soup, wheaten bread, fish, and cheese, and their fill of ale. At dinner each shall have as much bread as he wishes to eat, and at supper a loaf apiece.
Interesting. So you gotta come in for an extra day of work, but you get access to a hearty feast. I wonder how you'd feel about that as a peasant. Of course, you don't want to do any extra work, but, maybe if you get access to food that you wouldn't usually have, it might be worth it. The thing about the modern pizza party at work is, look, it's always nice to get free food, but it's not like we all can't go out and buy pizza on our own time, right? But if you imagine a situation where you really couldn't access that type of food, then maybe it'd be a little more worth it, that type of office pizza party, which this is the sort of medieval equivalent of. And as Max pointed out, when you're talking about these peasants, they would have, well, depends. I mean, if you're talking about the sort of independent yeoman farmer, perhaps he would be completely independent, but most of these peasants had some degree of obligations to their feudal lord, right? Which could range from, really full serfdom, in which you really had very little surplus for yourself, or on perhaps the lighter end of things, maybe you had a day of labor to do for your lord a week, right? And that is a day of free labor you would do for your feudal lord, right? Not earning profit or even earning subsistence for yourself, but earning profit for your lord, working their land for them. Without getting paid.
Also, I found that quote through Jenny Draper, or Jay Draper, who is a wonderful person to follow and a wonderful person to take a tour from if you're going to London. Now, it seems that at this medieval work pizza party, you would be fed your fill of cheese and ale and bread and beef and fish. And since it's been a long time since I've done a fish recipe on the channel, I decided to do a fish recipe, but I had to find one that was appropriate for a peasant, meaning it couldn't have a lot of spices, which most recipes from this period did. And that's because most of the recipes that were written down were for the wealthy. But I did find a...
And that's the thing, when we're talking, and I imagine Max comes across this pretty frequently, but when we're talking about remaking recipes from history, most of the recipes you're gonna have throughout history are going to be from the wealthiest portion of society, right? The sort of cooking for common people, or even cooking for the middle class, only became more popular or more written down in the 19th century, perhaps the 18th century. You can find some of that sort of thing in the 1700s. You find a lot more of that in the 1800s, when there is a much larger, well-off, educated, reading middle class who likes to read about things like recipes. But before this sort of modern era, the vast majority of the recipes written down are going to be recipes for the aristocrats or for the wealthiest members of society. There are some exceptions, of course, and there's always more to find, but that's definitely going to be a struggle to find the sort of thing that you're looking for if you want to find how the common people of any particular time in the Middle Ages actually ate.
Did, and that's because most of the recipes that were written down were for the wealthy. But I did find a simple recipe for something called barbel, and this fish is perfect, because the barbel, though he be of a fine shape and looks big, yet he is not accounted the best fish to eat. And I feel that that is exactly the kind of fish that the Lord would be giving to his peasants. So this recipe, which comes from around 1450, is for barbel boiled. Take a barbel and cut him, and draw him round, and pike in the nape of the head, and seethe him in water and salt, ale and parsley. And when it beginneth to boil, skim it clean, and cast the barbel thereto, and seethe him. And his...
I love seeing some good Middle English, and this is, we're actually getting pretty late in that time period, in that, when we look at the evolution of English over time, you go back far enough, it's virtually unintelligible to you and I modern English speakers today. But I like that this era where you can still read it well enough, but it's sort of looking like some strange alternate version of our language, where everything's spelled differently and there are letters added in. It's always interesting to read through, but it also gives you an insight into how the language evolved over time.
Sauce is garlic or verge sauce, and then serve him forth. Now, I searched high and low for barbel, but I just could not find them, at least here in the US. What they are is a river bottom feeding fish in the carp family. So I was able to find some fillets of carp, but even those were actually quite difficult to come by. So if you want to use catfish, I think that's probably going to be also pretty close. So for this recipe, what you'll need is about 1.5 pounds or 700 grams of fish, 2 teaspoons of salt, 3/4 of a cup of parsley leaves, 1 quart or 1 liter of ale. Now you're probably not going to find the type of ale that they had during the Middle Ages. That is really something that you need to make on your own, and I will be doing that for a future video, but not today. Today, you just find something that is low in hops, and that'll do.
Yeah.
You'll also need about 3 quarts or 3 liters of water. So first add the ale to a pot, and then add the water and the salt and set it on the stove to boil. Now you don't want this to be a vigorous boil, just a gentle simmer really. Then you add in the parsley leaves, and then finally the fish. And depending on how thick the fish is, or if it's a whole fish, it's going to take anywhere from 5 to 8 minutes to cook. Now ideally you would use a fish that is either whole or at least has the skin on it. I wasn't able to get that. I do think that that would at least make it hold together a little bit better, because taking it out once it is cooked is a little bit difficult. It really just wants to kind of fall apart. So frankly, I think that grilling the fish or roasting the fish or pretty much any other way of cooking this fish would be preferred, and that's how we would do it today. But during the Middle Ages, they really liked to boil pretty much everything, both meat.
I'd say that style of cooking persists in Britain today. I gotta tell you, the main method of cooking is boiling. Doesn't matter what it is, you're gonna boil it. I'm poking a little bit of fun, but there's some truth to that, let me tell you. As someone who has both British and American citizenship, I can talk from both sides of the pond. There really is a lot of boiling going on over in the UK, whereas at least in the United States, there's a lot more grilling and roasting and different types of cooking your meat and vegetables and all other types of things. So boiling, big part of the medieval diet, a big part of the British diet today.
And fish and anything else. So that's how we're going to do it. And as much as I do enjoy medieval cooking, I gotta say I'm never gonna get used to the boiled meat and the boiled fish. I'm just not really a fan. What I am a fan of is the incredibly comfy socks that I'm wearing today from today's sponsor, Bombas. Bombas has always made absolutely fantastic socks.
So, as I always do, I will have his video linked down below, and you should go and check it out and leave it a like and subscribe to his channel if you haven't done already. We want to show Max Miller our support for making these fantastic videos. You can go and check out his sponsor too if you'd like. You know, we like to watch these, react to them, so we want to make sure we show lots of support to the original creators, and so I'll let the rest of the ad play through.
Even some really comfy slippers. And whenever you purchase any item from Bombas, they donate an item to a shelter. Mostly t-shirts, socks, and underwear, which are the most requested items at shelters. So feel good and do good with Bombas, knowing that your purchase will do some real good. And right now, new customers will get 20% off of their first purchase when you use my link in the description. That is bombas.com/tastinghistory, and use my code tastinghistory20 at checkout. And now, once you have boiled your fish, make sure to keep the liquid, because we're going to need some of that for the sauce. Now, the original recipe says that it will work with either a garlic sauce or a verga sauce. Or
what is a verga sauce?
Green sauce, which is something made with herbs, and I made that a few years back, so I'm going to go with the garlic.
That's so funny, verga sauce. You can see how English is in transition into becoming more modern English, because verga, it sounds so much similar to green in a couple other European languages.
And luckily, I found a 15th century recipe that says, take kernels of walnuts and cloves of garlic and pepper, bread and salt, and cast all in a mortar, and grind it small, and mix it up with the same broth that the fish was sodden in, and serve it forth. Very simple and appropriate for the peasantry, because it only has one spice, pepper, rather than many spices, which most sauces from this time have. So for this sauce...
Well, the world economy really revolved around spices at this time. Now, that's not to say that the economy of every country revolved around spices. That is not true. But when I say the world economy, I really mean it. If you look at a lot of the long-distance shipping and trade of this era, a lot of it was done in spices. You can think about the Silk Road out east, the spice trade all the way from Asia through the Middle East and then to Europe. And there's a lot to say about that, sort of geopolitically, but forget all that. Basically, spices were very valuable. They were pretty hard to get out in these European countries, right? They were mainly accessible to the wealthiest members of the society. And so if you had access to a lot of spice, that was a show that you were a pretty wealthy individual because they were shipped from such a long distance and took such a long time to arrive in these European countries.
So what you'll need is 3/4 of a cup or 80 grams of walnuts, 2 cloves of garlic crushed, a half teaspoon of pepper, 1 cup of stale breadcrumbs, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and 1 cup or 235 milliliters of the boiling liquid. So you can crush everything up in a mortar if you like, or you can just add all of the ingredients, except for the liquid, to a blender and grind everything together. Then add that to a pot along with the liquid. Now the recipe doesn't actually say that this should be cooked, and there are some uncooked sauces from this period, but very often when they include breadcrumbs, it needs to be cooked simply because the breadcrumbs are then going to act as a thickener. Also, the raw garlic is going to be very, very strong if we don't cook it, so I'm going to cook it for just about...
I was going to say, there's not a ton of flavor going on aside from the garlic in there. It's going to be very garlicky, so cooking that will help. And also you'll find that, I mean, we include breadcrumbs in things today, but given that bread was such a big part of the medieval diet, you'll find a lot of different dishes would include bread, or sometimes you may not necessarily expect it, or they had a lot of bread dishes which we might not eat today.
About 5 minutes on very low heat, and that will let the sauce thicken up. And as it thickens, just a reminder that if you want a signed copy of the Tasting History Cookbook before the holidays, now is getting to be the last chance to order them, so I'll put a link in the description to where you can order those. They do ship internationally and domestically. And now, let us take a look at how to feed a medieval peasant, or rather, how the medieval peasants fed everyone else.
Right.
So when you discuss the peasantry of medieval Europe, it's very easy to kind of see them as a monolith. They were all poor and exactly the same, but they were not at all. They were...
Yeah, very true, very fair, right? That's why, we don't always want to generalize, but when you're talking about how to eat like a medieval peasant, you're going to have to generalize to a certain extent, because it's just going to depend where you look, depend on the region, depend on the time period, right? Certain times you had a series of failed harvests, you had famines, other times you had relative prosperity. And once again, when we think about peasants, there's this entire spectrum from, what you're imagining in our sort of popular fiction or popular imagination of the repressed serf who really had nothing for theirself and everything was gray and blah, 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 all the way up to some peasants who were relatively prosperous and even occasionally could be wealthy, right? Now, remember, we're talking about a distinction here in society between the aristocracy, the sort of the middle class or the middling class, oftentimes in the cities, and then kind of everybody else. And there was not a lot of social mobility between those classes, particularly between everyone else and the aristocracy. And so you could be a peasant who was actually relatively wealthy, right? Depending on the time and place, but there are plenty of examples of peasants who did own their own land, who made a relatively good income from producing and even selling to the market, and who then could even hire on other laborers to help work their properties, right? So, and there's all things in between that large spectrum, right? Those who own their land, and independent yeomen who may not have been making a lot of profit or a lot of surplus, but were, making enough to sustain themselves. Those who were not entirely sort of indentured to their lords, but had a certain degree of obligations, which was a lot of peasants, while still having some time to make food for their own subsistence or even a bit of market profit themselves. So there's a lot of different types of medieval peasants.
A very diverse group. Some were very wealthy, some were very poor, and there were different levels of freedom.
Yes.
There were those who, while they paid rent to their lord and were obliged to work their land, were also free to move or start small businesses on the side, like brewing ale or weaving cloth, businesses that could eventually make them very wealthy. Then there were those who were typically not free to do those things, the serfs or villeins.
Yeah.
This was typically a much larger portion of the population and were effectively tethered to the lord's land and not free to leave.
Yeah, and sometimes the line between a serf and a peasant, or a serf and a non-serf, because they're all peasants, could be pretty fuzzy. I think the sort of hard line is, are you or are you not tethered to the land? But sometimes even that can be a little fuzzy, where you were not sort of technically legally tethered to the land, but there were a whole bunch of impediments in your way to stop you from leaving. So that's why I talk about a spectrum here. It's not like these are all completely separate groups. There was a lot of overlap between these different types of peasants.
And what all of these people, all of the peasants, had in common was that they typically worked the land to feed not only themselves, but also everyone above them, be it the church, the nobility, or the royals. As the 14th century chronicler Jean Froissart put it, it is a custom in England, as in several other countries, for the nobility to have great power over the commoners, who they keep in bondage. That is to say, their tenants ought by custom to labor the Lord's land, to harvest his grain, and to make their hay, and cut their wood, and bring it home. So in practice, how it worked was a lord would have a manor, or very often many manors, that were a couple hundred to a few thousand acres large, and they would divide much of that up into strips of land and give those to a peasant family to work. Now, they weren't giving them to them. The peasant family had to pay rent to work that land. And usually that rent came in a portion of what was grown on the land, or sometimes in cash, or it was a mixture of both. And then also it was paid in additional labor on the land that the Lord had not rented out. So you find documents from this period that detail exactly what every single peasant owes to their Lord. In addition, it would tell you how much work a peasant had to do for their Lord each year. And sometimes it wasn't very much at all, just a few days a year when the harvest came in and stuff like that. But then sometimes it was a lot of work.
Yeah, we're talking about a really big range here. Like he said, sometimes only a couple of important days a year. Sometimes we're talking about several days out of each week laboring for the Lord, right? So quite a big range. Once again, quite the spectrum, depending on who you were.
Like Reynold at Sol holds one vergate of land and must work for the first 4 days in every week throughout the year. And if any feast day shall fall on these days, it shall be allowed him as a working day. Then the document goes on to specify that should it not be the time of year that the actual crops need tending to, because it was pretty seasonal, there was plenty of other work that the peasant had to do. Whether that was making fences, he had to do 32 feet a year. Hedges, 24 feet a year. He also had to muck out the stalls and make straw and all of these other things.
Yeah, and it's also during this time period, and I'm saying that pretty broadly, but sort of through the late Middle Ages, you begin to see the enclosure movement, right? Where essentially a lot of peasants, whether working on the Lord's land or those who actually owned their own property, which was less common, but a lot of these peasants had access to something called the commons, right? So we're talking about forests, open fields, which everyone had common access to go and harvest, perhaps some crops in the woods. Crops isn't the word I'm looking for. To go and harvest some plants in the woods, to go and chop down some trees, get some branches, sticks, that type of thing. The open fields to go and graze their animals, their livestock, which everybody shared. But really, from the sort of time we're talking about here onwards, through the 1500s, 1600s, 1718, I mean, this was a process that took hundreds of years in a variety of different places. The lords began to enclose this property, as in they took property that was once seen to be used commonly or owned commonly by the people, and they fenced it off and said, nah, you can't use this anymore. This is mine. You're not allowed to come over here and pick up sticks or pick up thyme in the woods or whatever you were doing, or go and forage for mushrooms, right? Nope, not gonna happen. Which was a pretty important way that a lot of peasants kept their families alive during hard times, right? And so you can see a lot of these peasants were losing even more control over the land and resources around them over time. And of course, this led to life becoming untenable for a lot of people in the late Middle Ages into the early modern era. And a lot of those peasants, what did they do? Well, they were forced to pick up and move into the cities, which is pretty important if you want to, develop trade and manufacture in the cities. And all of this builds to a lot of large historical trends over time, right? The emergence of a lot of manufacturing in cities, industry, even factories after enough time. in the very early stages of industry and industrialization. But I mean, that's a much larger historical trend. We're getting a little off the topic here, just to say that, things were often tough for peasants and were getting more tough over time.
So, yes, he was working 4 days a week and had holidays off, but he was still working a lot throughout the year. And that's why you'll see this meme online that says, a medieval peasant didn't work as many days as you do. That is so not true. First of all, they worked from sunup till sundown doing backbreaking work, and that was just the work that they had to do for the Lord. They also still had to work their own land all of the rest of the time, so they didn't really get days off. And that's why when the peasants finally got a chance to free themselves from this never-ending cycle of backbreaking work for subsistence wages, they decided to do something about it. See, the first half of the 14th century was pretty much horrible for everyone. The previous few centuries had been what was called the medieval warm period, and that was because Europe was uncharacteristically warm. They were even growing grapes in central England, and it made it so...
And just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here, we're only talking about the difference of a few degrees Celsius, right? That is the change we're talking about as we go from the warm period to the little ice age we're about to see. So only the change of a couple of degrees, and that totally altered the climate of Europe and all these countries and regions we're talking about. Just to give you an idea of when we look at, for example, climate change today, doesn't take many degrees to completely change things up and make things a lot worse for people. And that's what we're going to see with the cold spell that's about to descend on Europe, which is going to coincide with the Black Death, unfortunately.
Harvests in general were very good, which led to population growth. For instance, in England, where the records are pretty well kept, the population doubled by many accounts, if not more, between the years 1100 and 1300, from about 2 million, 2.5 million to 5 million or something like that. And it was because they had so much food. But around the year 1300, the continent began to slide into what is known as the Little Ice Age, which led not only to a change in growing patterns, i.e. no more grapes in England, but also just a lot more failed crops in general.
Yes, I mean, the important thing, this is a crazy image, by the way, but, it is less important that you weren't growing grapes anymore. What was far more important was the fact that, one, a lot more failed crops, and two, most importantly, shorter harvest seasons, right? You're able to plant less crops, essentially, and so your yield, your output, is going to decrease pretty substantially. And remember, even though we're talking about how there's a lot of food to go around, the population increased, it's not like everyone was living in wealth, right? A lot of people were living on the knife's edge. A level of poverty and subsistence that many of us can't even imagine today. And so when you see a decrease in the crop yield of, 5%, 10%, more than that, that already is going to mean a lot of people simply cannot feed themselves, and you're going to see a lot of famine. Doesn't take much to cause mass destruction and harm to people's lives.
From 1315 to 1317, a series of heavy rains and disease among livestock led to the Great Famine, which ravaged all of Europe, leading to an 80% decline in food production.
Jesus Christ, 80%! I was talking 5 to 10%. Though the point I was making is that even 10% would be bad. 80%, yeah, that means basically everyone's gonna die. You're gonna see massive waves, not just of population stagnation, but of death. And of course, once again, we haven't even talked about the Black Death yet, which is coming. So a lot of things are not going right at the same time.
Places. Food prices rose between 100 and 300% in just a couple of years, and nobody was spared. In Bristol, the Annals of Bristol in 1315, it says a great famine of dearth, with such mortality that the living could scarce suffice to bury the dead.
Jesus.
Horse flesh and dog's flesh was accounted good meat, and some eat their own children.
Ugh.
The death toll during the Great Famine is estimated to be between 10 and 20% of the population
Wow.
in some places, which, while tragic, was merely a prelude to what was going to come.
Yep.
Because in 1346,
There we go.
the Black Death first came to Europe. And in less than a decade, 30 to 50% of the population was dead.
So, like I was saying, you get this little ice age, decreased crop yields, which coincides with the Black Death. So those together, you're seeing, once again, it depends on the region, but 30% to 50, 60, a majority of your population dying, right? I mean, this was truly apocalyptic, a truly devastating time to live in, but it did have some interesting effects on the economy, the politics, and the lives of the surviving peasants, especially as the years continued. But yeah, truly devastating.
Some villages saw a 100% mortality rate, so that by the latter half of the century, there were no longer enough peasants alive to work the fields of the nobility. Now, the decreased population was not the only factor that led to what happened in the second half of the century, but it was a major factor because with less people, those remaining people could demand more for their labor.
Exactly. They had more leverage, right? I mean, you just mentioned towns that there weren't enough peasants left to even farm the land. Now, that's bad for the peasants, but also not good for the lord either. If you're the lord of that town, all your peasants are dead, then what are you gonna do? You're in trouble, right? And so imagine a situation where a good chunk of your peasant population has died off. You've only got, 60%, 50%, even less of the remaining peasant population. They've got a lot more leverage over you, right? They can make demands that you really have no choice but to accept, because if you don't accept, then they can simply pick up and leave. There's a lot of open land now. A lot of people have died. Once again, 30 to 50% of the population. And so if a peasant feels like they're not getting a fair deal, they can simply go somewhere else. And that's what a lot of them did, even if they weren't supposed to, right? If they were a serf, if they had, some impediment to them leaving, well, they would like to see you try to stop them, right? There's not a lot of manpower to go around. The peasants can also band together, start a rebellion, stand up, and some of them did, right? So this was a time when, not to say things were hunky-dory for the peasants, they just experienced this remarkable tragedy and devastation, but it did lead to them having a little bit more leverage over the feudal lords.
Should they be able to leave and do that? But most people, a good portion of the population, especially in England, were serfs. And so even if the manor next door said, hey, I'll give you 2 shillings and a pig if you come work my fields for the week, and your lord was saying, no, I'm going to still pay you what I was paying your grandfather 50 years ago, you had to go work for that guy. You weren't allowed to take that new job at the new price. Now, I know this is going to seem like...
Unless the situation gets so bad that you and your peasant buddies band together and enter rebellion, which is what happened from time to time, right?
A stretch, but just imagine living in the years after a great plague when prices have skyrocketed because of a lack of supply and a lack of labor. But you are still living off of wages that have pretty much remained stagnant for decades, so you can't afford the rent and the food anymore. Just imagine that. Well, this frustration
I'm imagining. It's not hard to imagine.
naturally led to a series of revolts, mostly amongst the peasantry throughout Europe in the latter half of the 14th century, and the most well-documented took place in England. There, things had been exacerbated by high taxes to pay for the 100 Years' War, and there was a lack of trust in the courts and the officials of King Richard II. And finally, a poll tax was implemented. And this poll tax was 4p per person. Whether you were dirt poor, it was 4p, or fabulously wealthy, it was still fourpence.
The poll tax, not popular either in the Middle Ages or in the 1980s.
And so that was actually the final trigger that in May of 1381 instigated an uprising amongst different classes of people from Kent, led by Wat Tyler. On June 13th, the rebel army crossed London Bridge and entered the city, opening prisons, burning the homes of people like John of Gaunt, one of the richest men in England, and perhaps most importantly, they were there to destroy documents. All sorts of court documents, but many were the types of documents that I've been reading from today, the ones that said exactly how much a person owes to their lord and who is servile to who.
Yeah, these peasants knew what they were doing, right? In England, even at that time, was still a pretty legalistic society, and so their bright idea, and it really was a bright idea, is if we get in there, we destroy all these documents that hold us to the land, essentially keep us as serfs, then we will have the freedom to do whatever we want. And frankly, they were already doing whatever they wanted.
They strove to burn all old records, and they butchered anyone who might know or be able to commit to memory the contents of old or new documents. It was dangerous enough to be known as a clerk, but especially dangerous if an inkpot should be found at one's elbow. Such men scarcely or ever escaped from the hands of the rebels. On the 15th of June, Wat Tyler and the rebels met at Smithfield, outside of London, to put their demands to King Richard II, who had promised to pardon all involved. Among other things, their demands included an end to serfdom, meaning a peasant could leave the land for a better offer, a right to work other jobs, that is, a right to have a side hustle, and a right to rent land at a just price, because the rent was just too damn high. Now, at first, the king seemed amenable to this, but then one of his men insulted Wat Tyler, and Wat Tyler attacked him, supposedly, allegedly attacked him, and that led to Wat Tyler getting slashed with a sword and eventually beheaded. And at that point, the king also kind of turned around and said, you know what, I'm not pardoning everyone. Everyone who was involved is going to be hunted down and executed. Most importantly, he didn't give in to any of their demands. Rather, he is quoted as saying, "Villains you are, and villains you shall remain." Villains being another word for serf.
Right.
But while he did...
And y'all might have sort of wondered earlier, villain? Oh, that's our modern word for like a bad guy. Yeah, that is where it comes from. It was another name for a serf.
Not end the practice of serfdom in England, which had already started to die out. It did begin to accelerate the process because many serfs were just willing to take the price of possible punishment in order to find a much better job paying much better wages.
Yeah, exactly. Like, this particular rebellion might not have ended the way that its supporters wanted, but it was a sign of times a-changing, right? You know, just people were so desperate, things were so bad that the serfs, even if they were still technically bound to the land, like I was saying earlier, just decided to pick up and leave, whether they were starting a rebellion or just leaving to find a better gig. It's funny, the demands, they're sort of asking for the implementation of some type of market into whatever they were doing, which of course would be the next progression from feudalism onto, market capitalism, though there's still a long time before we get there, but you can start to see elements of that emerging.
In fact, serfdom officially didn't go away in England until 1574, 200 years later.
You think that's late? Serfdom lasted a remarkably long time in a lot of places. I mean, a lot of people might think of Russia, where it lasted until the mid-1800s, but even a lot of more sort of progressive countries, it lasted a lot longer than you might think, though the asterisk there is that in a lot of countries, by the time they officially abolished serfdom, the practice itself had already become vestigial, as in it was not very common at that point.
Queen Elizabeth officially ended the practice in England. And the system of peasants paying for their rent with food and work eventually just kind of evolved into the system that we have now, where we pay with money. Now, obviously, life now is very, very different than life in the Middle Ages, much better, but it is interesting to kind of see some of the parallels.
Right, and I could tell he was hinting at that earlier, right? once again, I obviously agree with him that life today is much, much better and more prosperous than it was to be a medieval peasant, but you can see some similar trends in action today.
Of just how people behaved and how people worked and different practices. Like now, when your boss wants you to come in for some extra work, they will bribe you with food. That would be pizza or maybe cupcakes. In the Middle Ages, you would be bribed with cheese, bread, meat.
Yeah, though my question still stands. I reckon that bribe was probably more effective back in the Middle Ages when that type of food was less accessible. To where, honestly, these days a pizza party's not a great bribe. Once again, because you can just go and get pizza somewhere else. Oh, don't get me wrong, it's always nice to have some free pizza. But I reckon that bribe used to be a little more effective.
Ale, and something like this dish of fish. And here we are, a 15th century fish with garlic and walnut sauce, perfect for a medieval peasant. So first I'm going to just start with a piece of the fish. Get it off. There are bones in this, I am realizing.
Oh.
A lot of bones. Just gonna taste the fish by itself.
Bro did not debone that fish.
Alright, I was wrong. Boiled fish is actually just fine. I guess it's sort of like poached fish. Never had carp. It's actually quite nice. I wonder if it's farmed instead of like been eating mud. I don't know. It's actually
Maybe.
quite good. Anyway, let me try the sauce. So I'll just dip a bit into some of the sauce. Now the sauce is rather grainy. Let me get a little bit here. You can see, especially as it cools, it starts to really thicken up. It's just from the breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
It is rather grainy. You can strain it. They very often did. If you have like large pieces, you can strain those out, but you don't want to strain it too much to get it too thin because then you're going to lose the walnuts and everything. And
Yeah. Plus, you don't want to lose all the stuff you put in there. Also, if you're eating this as an aristocrat, maybe you'd want it strained. But I imagine as a peasant, you're going to want all the stuff in there. You want as much quantity of food as you can get. So I don't think you'd want it strained too much.
I think that's going to be most of the flavor. Here we go. That's garlicky.
I'm not surprised.
But not overpowering. I actually wish it was more walnut. I guess walnut's a pretty mild flavor in comparison.
Yeah, to be honest, that's sort of what I thought earlier, which is that a lot of those flavors are pretty mild compared to garlic. Especially raw garlic, but he did cook it. But even so, the garlic was the standout flavor compared to the rest.
Comparison with garlic. So many sauces from this period are flavored with a lot of spices and vinegar. Most of them you'll actually find are vinegar-based sauces. So this is kind of unique and a nice change.
Hey, think about fish and chips today, right? You're gonna splash some vinegar on top of that fish.
I guess if you're a peasant, this is the way to go. It's nothing to revolt over, but it's also nothing to write home about.
He doesn't seem too impressed. I think, it might have helped if the fish was deboned beforehand. But, yeah, it's simple boiled carp with a relatively simple sort of garlic sauce. But, if you were a medieval peasant, probably would have been pretty enjoyable. And, we talked about how it's hard to generalize, but one thing that is easy to generalize is that our diets today have so much more spice, fat, and sugar than the diet of the medieval peasant. I think their diet would have seemed sort of endlessly bland to us, whereas our diet to them, the flavor would have been crazy, just because sugar especially in the American diet, is so much more widespread today. These peasants would have had access to almost no sugar. Their sweeteners would have been, honey, or even more commonly, fruits and berries. Even a lot of fat. We have so much fat, saturated fat today. Fat would have been less common, right? Spices, flavor. And so I imagine a dish like this is probably interpreted pretty differently for us than it would have been by, a peasant in the mid 1400s or whatever.
Definitely gonna eat that cheese and bread though, and the ale. So overall, not a bad meal, nothing to write home about. I'm very glad that I'm not a medieval peasant, but it's a good dish, you know. It's hearty and would make for a good after-work meal on a boon day where you've been harvesting all day. Luckily, I'm not harvesting all day, so, you know, that's good. Anyway, I'll see you next time on Tasting History.
Alrighty, well, there we go. The end of our second Tasting History reaction. I gotta say, I think I preferred the Indian pudding that we saw last time. That one actually looked really tasty. This was a pretty simple meal, which is understandable. So we got to talk about how to eat like a medieval peasant. Some really fascinating stuff. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and I'll give you access to a whole bunch of exclusive content. With all of that out of the way, hope you guys are having a fantastic day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.